Continuing on with Chapter 38, we're looking at all the changes that are occurring during the 1960s. Now, continuing on with LBJ's presidency, there's a lot of stuff going on for him during his time in office. Aside from just trying to change society with the Great Society program that he had implemented, his domestic plan that's very reminiscent of the New Deal, Lyndon Johnson also had to deal with an escalation in Vietnam. And actually, this is why many people believe that his presidency was a failure. LBJ was a true believer in containment, that he can't let South Vietnam fall to the communists, no matter what. It can't be on his watch. And so in August of 1964, he was given the excuse that he needed in order to get American troops into this civil war between the North and the South. A North Vietnamese patrol boat fired on the USS Maddox while it was patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin. This is exactly what he wanted to have happen so that he has a reason to get involved. He asked Congress for increased war powers. They responded by passing the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. This is essentially a blank check to the president. Basically, the president now has all of these war-making powers. He doesn't have to ask Congress for permission. It's allowing him to use his power as commander-in-chief. This is not a declaration of war. Congress is the only one allowed to use this. But basically, LBJ can do what he wants in Vietnam without much congressional oversight. And so starting in February of 1965, the U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder. These are sustained bombing raids over North Vietnam. This is not going to be enough, and we're going to see during LBJ's presidency an escalation of our involvement, starting with what was supposed to just be bombing raids, to then advisors, to then protecting a military base, to full-on American soldiers engaged in this war. In the 1964 election, Johnson ran against Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was a strict conservative. He attacked all of Johnson's programs, but in the end, people were still on LBJ's side. He had extreme support for the efforts in Vietnam. His Great Society helped him to win this election, a huge margin of victory, 486 electoral votes to 52. But there was a little bit of a break with the Solid South. That Solid South isn't so solid anymore towards the Democrats. So the New Deal, I referenced this on the last slide. The New Deal, like I said, this is LBJ's domestic policy at this time. It's very similar to what we saw under FDR with the New Deal. Some of the holdovers from the New Frontier. In fact, many of these things are things that JFK had wanted to pass but obviously didn't live to see happen. And really it's focusing on the big four areas of reform: education, medical care for the elderly and the poor, immigration reform, and voting rights. All of that obviously dealing with social reform and racial justice. He's also heavily influenced by that book that we already talked about, which said that 50 million people were living in poverty at this time. That War on Poverty program is going to be huge with this as well. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, passed in 1965, is the biggest education bill ever passed at this time, granting millions upon millions of dollars to schools and library material, books, etc. for elementary and secondary education. Up until this point, education has largely been a state's issue. The federal government is now getting more involved. Also passed, Head Start, once again dealing with education, granting preschool education to those children living in poverty to give them a head start. And then also we have still today, obviously, our Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is really just an add-on to the Social Security that we've already seen happening, granting hospital insurance to everyone over the age of 65. Medicaid grants health insurance to welfare recipients. And then finally for this slide, the immigration reform with the Nationality Act of 1965. That's ending the quota system that we've talked about in the past that was based on the national origins. But it is going to limit the total number of immigrants allowed into the country at about 20,000 per year. There is a family reunification clause, so if the father's already in the United States, the rest of the family is allowed to go. So it's a little bit more even because it's not so heavily geared to Western Europe like we saw in 1924. So voting rights, one of those big four that he is focusing on. And obviously this is heavily influenced by the civil rights movement that was going on at this time. Remember, the civil rights movement is a grassroots movement. Regular people forcing the government to pay attention, to do what needs to be done. And what needed to be done was African Americans had largely still been denied their voting rights. We've talked about this already. Poll taxes, literacy tests, publishing black people's names in the paper if they chose to register, obviously, in order to intimidate them. And so there needed to be a change. Mississippi, as one prime example, only 5% of its eligible black people were actually registered to vote at this time. And so in January of 1964, the 24th Amendment was ratified to the Constitution, abolishing poll taxes in all federal elections. So that is a step in the right direction, but it's still not enough. It's still not taking care of these literacy tests and other things going on in the Deep South. So student volunteers, namely from SNCC and CORE, that's the Congress on Racial Equality, organized a voting registration drive through Mississippi because Mississippi had long denied African Americans the right to vote. This is in the summer of 1964. 100,000 student volunteers traveling through Mississippi trying to get African Americans to register to vote. During this Freedom Summer, as it was called, 3 student volunteers actually disappeared. The local police said they were never here. They said that there was nothing afoul with them, but it was later found out that they were executed, point blank, shot in the head, and then buried in a shallow grave. And when this came out in the ensuing investigation, they discovered that 21 people, including the sheriff of the town, was in on these murders. So this is showing you how serious this is. Pushing for these civil rights is not an easy thing because there's a lot of pushing back. In 1965, the SCLC and SNCC once again staged another campaign in Selma, Alabama, pushing for more voting rights. At this time, they were half of the population. African Americans were half of the population, but only accounted for 3% of registered voters. That's insane. So obviously, Martin Luther King, along with about 6,000, thousands of volunteers, marched on Selma advocating for voting rights. Now remember, the idea here is to get regular people to pay attention, to force the government to do what it's supposed to do. And in the Selma campaign, once again, protesters were arrested, they had dogs turned on them, they had hoses turned on them, and tear gas. And all of this was being seen on TV. So your regular American who might not have thought one way or another about segregation or voting rights is all of a sudden confronted with these images. We can't turn a blind eye anymore. And so in the end, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act that had been proposed by JFK before his assassination, pushed forward by that March on Washington and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, finally became a reality. This is a landmark piece of legislation. The Voting Rights Act of 65 ended literacy tests. And more than that, it sent federal registrars into the South in order to allow African Americans the right to vote. We're not leaving it up to the southern states to do it anymore. Federal registrars are going to go in and ensure that elections are being done the right way. This law changed voting in the South. It tripled the number of registered voters in the South, black voters in the South. Obviously, the civil rights movement is being pushed forward. Here you see this is the FBI poster looking for those 3 missing students during Freedom Summer. Here you see the police attacking people with clubs, tear gas, etc., and those marchers in Selma. So poor LBJ, he is dealing with 2 major issues going on in American society. On the one side, he's got this civil rights movement going on. He's trying to push forward his Great Society program, but at the same time, he also has to deal with Vietnam. This is going to cost a lot of money trying to do all of these things. So what was only supposed to be a little bit of American involvement after the Tonkin Gulf incident is going to escalate. There were retaliatory bombing raids on the American bases and South Vietnamese bases after Operation Rolling Thunder had started. So, in order to ensure that Americans could win this war quickly, LBJ ordered thousands of troops into Vietnam, 184,000 American troops by the end of 1965. The hope was that by Americans coming into this war that it would drive the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army back over the 17th parallel. This is steadily becoming an Americanized war. We are propping up the South Vietnamese government. But the media spin at this time is painting it in a much different picture. It's showing that we are an ally to democracy. South Vietnam's government was not a democracy, but that is what the propaganda is promoting at this time. This is nothing less than escalation because we are afraid of that domino theory. Now, this war, there are a lot of correlations between the United States in the Vietnamese War, in this Vietnam War, as there was for the British in the Revolutionary War. Our downfalls in Vietnam. What is our reason for being there? The American soldiers there, what is their drive to win? They don't achieve anything by pushing further and further and further. This is not a war that is going to help them in any way. We were unprepared for a jungle warfare. We didn't know how to face off against these guerrilla warriors, the Viet Cong. So our downfall obviously was their advantage. They were very used to the landscape. They obviously had a motivation for winning this war. Our advantages, though, were obviously our military and technological power, which LBJ thought would have been enough in order for us to win this war. So we start with the escalation in 65 with 184,000 American troops. By 1968, it's over 500,000 troops in Vietnam, costing us $30 billion per year. So we obviously know Vietnam is one of the least supported wars of all time. But how did that come about? How did we go from supporting the war effort and buying into the propaganda to all of a sudden completely opposing the Vietnam War? And it's going to be a somewhat gradual process. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we now have televisions in our homes. This is really the first living room war where Americans are able to watch what was going on from the comfort of their living rooms. American reporters were embedded with the soldiers in Vietnam. And there were very few rules about what was allowed to be seen in the media. So we were seeing everything. All of the atrocities. We were seeing American servicemen coming home in coffins. All of this is starting to change our position on the war. Add into that the use of the draft once again is turning Americans against the war. You see an increase in draft dodgers, meaning they left the country as opposed to being drafted for service, and protesters on college campus. We are questioning the purpose of this war. So to give you an idea of how quickly public opinion changed, in 1965, 15% of American population were against this war. By 1969, it's 69% of the population was against this war. That's how quickly it changed, just within 4 years period of time. So, adding to this, so the increasing number of casualties, American men coming home in boxes, the use of napalm, the use of Agent Orange is going to completely destroy the landscape of South Vietnam. Napalm, this is like a gasoline-based bomb, and when it hits, it basically ignites everything on fire. Whole villages would be destroyed with napalm. Agent Orange, this is a chemical that would be used. It's a defoliant, meaning it would destroy that dense jungle. So, several reasons for using Agent Orange. Number one was obviously so they could see where the enemy was, so we could uncover where their position was because the jungle was so dense. But number two, our goal is to disrupt the agriculture in Vietnam. Agent Orange has also been linked to birth defects among Vietnamese children and lots of cases of cancer as a result. So American servicemen stationed in Vietnam would go on what are called search and destroy missions. There's not a capital that we can capture. We're not going for Hanoi. Our goal here is to find Viet Cong and destroy them. Our victory is equated now to body counts. So on these search and destroy missions, they are looking for the Viet Cong. It's hard to know who is a Viet Cong and who is just a regular South Vietnamese citizen because they blend in so well. And so as a result, we see major atrocities going on, entire villages being massacred during these search and destroy missions. Now, obviously, atrocities were also being committed against American soldiers as well. And so General William Westmoreland, the general in charge of American efforts here, said that the only way we can win this war is if we, quote, win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. So our goal is to bring them to our side so that they would turn in the Viet Cong. This obviously didn't happen. And at the same time, as these anti-war groups back here in the United States started to grow, the FBI created their own little covert spying mission, codenamed COINTELPRO, spying on these anti-war groups, infiltrating them, and trying to discredit them from inside. These are the Doves. Doves versus Hawks. The Doves were against the war. Hawks were in favor of the war, accusing them from everything from communism to all sorts of things against the U.S. Here you see this is a napalm attack. These are South Vietnamese children fleeing from their village after it was napalmed. This child is naked because her clothes were burned right off of her body. All of this, once again, being seen on television. So when is the turning point? January 30th of 1968. This is the turning point in the Vietnam War. A ceasefire had been called to celebrate the Vietnamese New Year of Tet. A week-long ceasefire had been called. This was going to have celebrations, funerals, etc. during this war. However, and at the same time, I should also preface this by saying that the American people were constantly being told, peace is at hand, we're very close to peace, we're about to sign a peace agreement, figuring that any day now we would be done with this war. But during this week-long ceasefire, the Viet Cong launched a surprise attack, attacking 100 South Vietnamese towns, 12 U.S. bases, and killing lots and lots of people. High casualties in the capital of Saigon and the former colonial capital of Hue. The American people are flabbergasted. We thought we were in line to have a quick victory. All of a sudden, how can we be in line to having a quick victory if the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were able to stage this level of an attack without our even knowing it? It shook our confidence in the war. And this credibility gap started to widen. The gap between what our government was telling us and what we were seeing in the media. We are starting to distrust our government like never before. And after the Tet Offensive occurred, the solution, according to William Westmoreland, was for more troops. By this point, 50% of the American people felt the war was a mistake. They do not want to see escalation. They do not want to see an increase in the draft or our debt. Here you see all of the attacks being staged on during this Tet Offensive. This is a South Vietnamese soldier about to execute a Viet Cong during the Tet Offensive. And so right smack dab in the middle of 1968 is the 1968 election. LBJ, who would obviously have been, allegedly, the sure thing for the Democratic Party, begins to face opposition from within his own party. He is facing primary challenges from two doves, Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, who were running against him during the primary. This is unheard of for a sitting president to be challenged during the primary, especially when McCarthy and Kennedy started making a pretty good showing. So, in March of 1968, LBJ says, we're done escalating this war. Our goal now is going to be peace. He also shocked the nation by announcing he was dropping out of the election. He would not seek his party's nomination for the 68 election. And so what went on from there was a a fight for the Democratic nomination. Who would get it? Robert Kennedy was seen to be a sure thing after LBJ dropped out. That is until August of 1968 when he was actually assassinated as well after winning the California primary. In the end, the Democrats nominated Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey was LBJ's vice president. This did not go over well with anti-war protesters because he was seen as just being a continuation of LBJ. The Republicans nominated Richard Nixon back again. He was campaigning on a policy of law and order, to restore law and order to the United States because there's so much upheaval here at home. He's also campaigning on what's known as his Southern strategy. This is really, really, really important. The Southern strategy is basically his attempt to lure those conservative Southern voters away from the Democratic Party. He says it no longer makes sense why you are voting Democrat. Your Democratic Party has changed. Begin to vote Republican. And this is the moment that we see the switch. The Solid South is done. They are lured into Richard Nixon's Southern strategy. He is promoting law and order. He's also promoting what's known as an honorable peace in Vietnam, appealing to a group of people known as the silent majority. These are just regular people. They're not the crazy, loud, vocal anti-war protesters, just your regular, average, middle-class American, the pool and patio type, as I like to call them. And then finally, George Wallace for the American Independent Party. George Wallace was a crazy segregationist, also advocating for nuclear bombs to be dropped on Vietnam. Luckily, he didn't win, obviously. Nixon was elected, but he is considered a minority president because he did not get 50% of the vote. In fact, he only got 43% of the popular vote. So we've been referencing this counterculture for a while, or what people like to call the hippies. The youth movement of the 1960s obviously has its links in with the anti-war protesters at this time, but we also have to link it back to the anti-conformists from the 1950s, the Beat generation. People like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, who had been disillusioned with the establishment and the and the government during the 1950s and the conformity of the 1950s. Obviously, the hippie movement of the 1960s links in with that anti-conformity idea. At UC Berkeley, part of that anti-war protest was the free speech movement started in 1964. They were protesting not only against the war, but protesting against the economic victory that the U.S. government was getting from it. The corporations were profiting against this. This later morphed into the counterculture or the hippie movements. We tend to think of the hippie movement as a bunch of psychedelic drug users, and that's not 100% true. Some obviously were, some obviously were not. At the heart of the counterculture, they are questioning American society. They are questioning what they've always been told here in the United States. But there is some use of drugs being used. In fact, Tim Leary, who was a major advocate in the hippie movement, advocated for people to, quote, tune in and drop out, to use psychedelic drugs in order to reach another level, rebelling against everything that is considered traditional. Other groups within this counterculture movement, the Students for a Democratic Society, or what's known as the New Left. These are extremely liberal people, obviously, once again, having its link in the youth culture, who are advocating rapid and increasing changes to the United States. And then last but not least, going along with this or linking up with this counterculture is the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Lots of reasons why this is going on. Dr. Alfred Kinsey is one example. He was a researcher that did a lot of studies in sexuality here in America. And he said our ideas of gay and straight aren't actually true, that most of us have some of both within us. Add into that the use of birth control pills that are coming out at this time, and a sexual revolution is occurring. That even if this was happening before, it is now coming out more in American society. Homosexuality is being celebrated, premarital sex is going on, and adultery. People are giving up those Victorian norms as it relates to sex. And that's it for this chapter.